Our second conversation tonight, he was a literary stalwart, he was a poet, translator, essayist, scholar, and yet too many of us are familiar with the name but not necessarily the work of A.K. Ramanujan. He moved to the US at an early age of his life and very, very intriguingly described himself once as the hyphen in Indo-American. What does it mean to be that hyphen in Indo-American is a great question, one that I think our two speakers tonight are uniquely equipped to answer. One, probably a scholar who knows him better than any other. The second, probably a man who knows him better than any other, being his son. Krishna Ramanujan is, of course, he is a science journalist at Cornell. He writes in the life sciences, over 2,000 published articles to date, entirely separate from his literary interests and pursuit, and being the son of an absolute legend like A.K. Ramanujan. Guillermo Rodriguez is a Spanish, he's director of Casa de la India, a pioneering institute that works in Indo-Spanish cultural exchange. But he has also published a monograph called When Mirrors Are Windows, which was the first really comprehensive 500-page monograph on A.K. Ramanujan. However, what they have come together to do in particular this time is a unique exercise, which was to bring together the journals, the unpublished journals of A.K. Ramanujan, along with his poetry and some of his literary insights into one volume. Tonight, rather than only discuss the themes in his work, crucial as they are, rather than discuss his personal journey, crucial as that is, they have chosen, I think, most fascinatingly, to let his voice speak, to let us hear the writer rather than only talk of the writer. And that is, I think, a rare privilege, to be able not just to engage with his thought, but his very words from two people who, as I said, know him best. May I invite up on stage Guillermo Rodriguez and Krishna Ramanujan.
So we start on a lighter tone. Yeah. We are very, very pleased to be here in Delhi at this Gurgaon, Delhi. For me, I'm still not very familiar with this large, one of the biggest cities in the world. I think first of all, we would like to thank Algebra, the club, and the publisher, Penguin, Random House, for having organized this. It's been, this is our third presentation now in India. And Krishna very kindly agreed to come all the way from the US to do this presentation. I came from Spain. And I think what we would like to do this evening is take you all on a journey. And there are at least two types of journeys. One is the journey of making the book. How did we come to this point? What's behind the making of this book? Because every book has a story. And the story is outside and also inside. And then, of course, the second journey, and the most important, is the text itself, the story of a man, the story of a scholar, the story of a literary genius that is contained in his diaries, which we now bring to light. So we begin, perhaps, combining both, of course, which are very intimately connected. And the probably the starting point would be to very briefly introduce you to the character, because he's the man behind the diaries with multiple masks, I would say, if I could use that word. He used that metaphor very often, the man and the mask. Why? He was multifaceted. This is a scholar that is at the forefront. He's a pioneer, as was just mentioned, in the late 50s, and we will be part of that journey later on. He traveled to the US, somebody who is or hails from Mysore, Brahmin by birth. Though he renounced to his Brahminhood, he shed away his Brahmin thread at the age of 16. His parents were of Tamil origin from Chennai. There is a connection with, by the way, Ramanujan, the mathematician. Not a family connection, but the father named him Ramanujan after the famous mathematician because his father was a mathematician. So here we are in the 1940s. He studied in Mysore. He grew up there. He was steeped in Kannada as well as in Tamil, learning these languages. So multilingualism is very much influencing his life later on. And you may have heard of the famous metaphor that, downstairs in his Mysore house, he absorbed everything that was oral tales, women's tales, folklore, if you want, and the vernacular languages. And upstairs in his father's attic there was English and Sanskrit, and what was so-called higher learning, but he does not distinguish hierarchically. For him, it's all part of the same ecosystem. And this is important, and I want to highlight this, that for him, Indian literatures is a compendium, a network of traditions. So first of all, we have the languages. This is his background. He's well known for his collection of folk tales from India, which he published later on. He did a lot of work in that phase. He was teaching English in a number of universities. He went to high school, graduated in English, took a break, failed one of the exams, and one of the reasons he perhaps started to do creative writing is because he took a sabbatical and could spend time on writing. In the late 1950s, he took a leap, and like many of those young scholars of his generation, thought as an ambitious person and scholar, and he wanted to make it big and go to New York. He went to New York on a ship. A lot of scholars were getting scholarships by Fulbright and other funding agencies, and a lot of them stayed there. Some came back. So that changed entirely his life. He spent virtually half of his life at University of Chicago. And the concept of the hyphen, we'll come to that later, is much more than just a term. It's because he was not a person that went into exile. It's not exile, diaspora. It's rather a continuous dialogue. He went back and forth all the time in his work. And ironically, as he said, he was teaching English and Shakespeare and the classics in India. And when he went to the US, they hired him after doing his PhD at Indiana University. They hired him at University of Chicago, where he and a few others started Dravidian studies and pioneering research work and translation work on the South Indian classics from Tamil Sangam classics to a Tamil Sangam tradition, and also the medieval mystic poets of the Vachana tradition, the Shaivite as well as the Vaishnavite. So whereas in India he was teaching the Indian classics, in America he was teaching the Indian classics. And for the first time, and I end here this brief introduction, he introduced readers through his translations to a whole tradition that was unknown. At that time, only Sanskrit was in vogue as at Indological departments. And it was the first time that South Indian literatures were brought to a wider, I think he can be credited for that, for introducing South Indian classics to a wider readership, and not only introducing them, but as a modernist poet. And this is the other facet. So I said he's a scholar, he's a translator, he was a professor, he was a linguist, and he was at the forefront, or most importantly, the thread that runs through his career, he was a poet. And it's this thread that we found in his diaries. When I set out to do my PhD on A.K. Ramanujan, I had to study his papers, and they were lying at University of Chicago. Nobody had touched them. Unfortunately, he passed away at a very young age, at the age of 64. He was at the peak of his career. This is 1993. A few years later, I was encouraged by Girish Karnad to go to the papers, a treasure house of material, wrote this book, When Mirrors Are Windows, and I thought, well, there's so much material here, but there are all his diaries which are not accessible, restricted until 2014. When I published the book, 2016, went on a book tour in the US, and I was able to access the diaries for the first time. And there was this amazing material, one that particularly spoke to me, and that is the journey on the boat when he boarded the ship in Bombay, 1959, and the way, as a poet and as an imagist poet, He's bringing out the experiences in such a beautifully aesthetic way. And I called up his son, and now I pass the floor to him, and said, hey, we should do a book. At the same time, Penguin, and we have our dear friend Premanka Goswami here, approached us and said, we want to do something more intimate, a biography or something like that. We said, no, we don't have to do a biography. It's all there. Let the man speak. Let him tell his story. We just have to edit it. And please, Krishna, if you want to take it from there.
Thank you all for coming tonight. It's a great pleasure for us to be here. Guillermo contacted me, and one of the first things he discussed with me was he had found a travel log that my father had kept from his travels on the boat. He had received a Fulbright scholarship from India to America, and it was a 30-day boat ride, passing through France. And so the boat broke down near France, and they went overland for a bit. So they stopped in Paris, and all through this travel, he kept kind of travel log, a literary travel log. It's full of descriptions and insights and his own personal feelings about this travel. And it's written on the boat and some hotel letterhead. So Guillermo had found this document, and it was a very beautiful piece of writing. And he sent it to me, and we both agreed that this was really something that should be published. And that was kind of the beginning of it. So why don't I get started and jump into actually the book itself that we made last year. And so this first entry is from Mysore, September 1949, and it's the earliest known diary entry. My father was 20 years old. He was writing. It was a kind of exercise. He was writing a short story, a narrative about composing a poem. So he was writing about writing, and the piece is about a kind of a universal struggle that all artists feel in the desire to have their mind free to create that's always pushing against the banalities of life. And so it's a naive piece, but we see actually at a young age, at 20 years old, he was a very practiced writer. He had been putting some time into it, and it's quite obvious. So I'm going to get started here. I'm going to read a little section, the first paragraph of this piece. He was writing a poem, definitely not about the rapture of roses and the languors of lilies. He would not be conventional, old-phrased, a panderist to the lazy public. No, not the life of him. Tinned poetry, he called it, stale stuff. Not that for him. Good or bad, he would be himself, write himself, have his own home industry of phrases, where he turned poetic pottery at the whirling wheel of his own imagination. He would be clay, potter, painter, and the tanning, fixing sun all in one. The fancy pleased him immensely. He wrote it down in his daybook. He had a small, neat hand with rather feminine curves and angles. He admired it secretly, thought of a young, worship-eyed posterity, thought of how he shyly concealed all that behind a modest mask of diffidence, which had the trick of becoming agonizingly too real, the mask growing into the face. He lopped all those thoughts down. They were getting out of hand. He must think of the poem, his second.
The piece he just read is in the third person, so he had in mind already at some point maybe somebody would read it, and this line here is almost prophetic, where he says he thought of a posterity, worship-eyed posterity. At the age of 20, nobody knew him. He was obviously absolutely unknown. He was trying to bring into Canada, he was a Kannadiga, so he was also known as a Kannada poet. Of course, people there know him for having changed the poetic scene by writing very imagistic poetry. He was influenced as a modernist poet by Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, the new Navya poetry, which they called. So in that setting in the 1950s, he grew up, and it is said that people traveled for miles, hundreds of miles. Girish Karnad, who wrote the foreword to the book, and we're very grateful for him because Girish is no more, and it's probably the last piece he wrote after passing away. He wrote this a few months earlier. He said people used to go to Dharwad just to listen to him talk because he was so widely read. He'd absorbed science, all kinds of astrology and astronomy. He's got that famous saying that astrology and astronomy, it's not a contradiction because he saw it in his father. So I believe there was already a seed in these early poems. And before we come to the 1959 journey on the boat, I know this poem by heart, and since it's mentioned that A Life in Haiku, just to give you an idea, recite this short poem, very short poem, to tell you also how language was so important to him, images and language. And he played around with words, and he was almost scientific about it. He thought poems were like objects. They can hit at you, and they contain ideas, arts and ideas. And I saw those phrases you have there in the beginning by Einstein. I think you should have some more poets as well. Wallace Stevens, William Carlos Williams, no ideas but in things. That's William Carlos Williams, and he believed in that. No ideas but in things, which is, what a poem should be. So here's a poem. It's like a haiku-like poem, where the title is almost the most important thing. On the death of a poem. Images consult one another. A conscience-stricken jury, and come slowly to a sentence. There's the pun. Okay. Come on the boat journey. He was definitely new to the Western world. Boarded the ship, he had this great opportunity, like a lot of his colleagues at the time. He was probably older than them. A lot of them left in their 20s. He was already 30 years old. So he's a 30-year-old professor of English who's got fed up with provincial life at some point, and it's there in the diaries. He decides to try out a academic career, and he studies linguistics at Pune University. And in 1959, as we just mentioned, he boards the ship, which luckily for him almost broke down, and the second engine failed. It was supposed to go to Southampton. From there, he would board another ship to New York, but it had to stop at the port of course, it went via Aden, the Suez. The first halt where he could actually see Western architecture, Western life was Malta. And then, as I said, luckily for him, the ship had to stop in Marseille, and he was given the opportunity to travel overland. He visits all the wonderful, incredible museums of Paris. He was so much interested in pointillism, aesthetics in works of art, and that he had never been able to see only in books. So here's a piece I'm going to read out. This was written mostly on, as Krishna mentioned, also on board of the ship, and on the letterhead showed straight hat ship, and then it was the Queen Elizabeth. And this is an entry of July 17, 1959, Malta. To have lived in dozens of such exotic places till they are exotic no more, to have absorbed them till one understood their life ways and their stress, to live at ease among strangers, even in India, one could have done all that, but one didn't. One feels like rushing back and gathering all that experience one has missed, all in one back-breaking burden. I seem to have gathered nothing, shared nothing of my past. Every moment seems an alarming fresh beginning. Everyone else has plans because their future is continuous with their past. I seem to carry nothing, not even ideas. I hope that fear is not true. The more I gather these images, the more intense is my craving to be a writer of prose. Fixing these tantalizing images in words, this haze, the twinkling spangles on the sunlit bays, the sky fretted by the trees that look through the arches, the penciled aerials, the blood-red oars of a green boat with a red underside, this woman in a white dress with penny-sized spots of black, the blue jersey decked tennis players, this desire to talk to my steward, and that sad-looking flaxen-haired small woman with a typewriter, and the sudden responsiveness of an acquaintance, and all the small hours with their heavy procession of the images of my isolation. So, there's a doubtful person not knowing what the future will hold in store, and he's describing everything in such a beautifully expressive way, aesthetic way, already becoming the hyphen.
This next entry is actually 2 weeks earlier. It's from 6 July. This entry kind of highlights the comment made earlier about he called himself the hyphen between Indo-American. And I call these hyphen moments, and they're moments where he has a kind of discomfort in his identity, and he feels himself between past and future. Here he's literally between India and America, and he kind of has a conflict and struggle all the time inside of him, and he sees this conflict in his external surroundings at every moment. At the end of this section is a discussion of the Indian intellectual in the late 50s he's talking about. It's likely not true today, but this was how he felt at that time. And it continues this idea of not belonging, of not having a place. 6 July, 1959. Afloat with almost no past and no near future but the sea, just afloat in the decks of the present. Discussions are aperitifs. Time seems to have held its breath on a semicolon here. The space has a vague, slow curve going around us all over. Too many people have faith. Easily they speak of unspeakably intense experiences which changed them entirely and gave them and their world a new look. Today it was Miss Malani. Yesterday it was Eknath Iswaran. Both seem poised in their faith. I feel small and lost and infantile, disturbed by their peace. I was telling a young Australian how isolated an Indian intellectual is, with 16.6% who can read at all, and an overlapping 20% who are in cities like him, and only about 2% English knowing, and still fewer having his rationalist views, with fathers highly educated and mothers ignorant but strong in their hold on him, with every prudent man having a caste and insisting upon it, and he having none, but not modern enough to be entirely abreast of Western ideas, because books don't come too fast to India.
So this idea of him having, perhaps lagged behind because he couldn't catch up with what was happening in the West, it was the case for many intellectuals. But also he's utterly sincere. These diaries in these years, in this period of time, he didn't know he was going to be collecting his diaries throughout his life, and that it would eventually become a therapy for him, because he got interested in Jungian, diary method, journal method, where you keep a diary and that's where you project all your fears, all your ideas, and everything is there in the diaries. But at the same time, he used it as material for creative writing, and this is the other thread, that we've chosen particular pieces that relate to him as a creative writer. There's a lot of other personal struggle. For instance, see what he does with the boat journey diaries. Once he's written them, he goes back to them, and a few months later he types a few pieces as if he wanted to publish them, and it comes more of an interpretation, more a metaphorical thing. So he kind of tries to find these ideas in the lines he scribbled. And you can notice that the fresh diaries, they're not edited. He just scribbles on them, and sometimes it's hard reading, and we'll come to another passage where it's all like kind of prose poetry. Amazing how he could also write so aesthetically without even thinking, just like very spontaneously. But this particular passage I'm going to read out is an interpretation of that journey, typed, and says, 1959 July, somewhere on the Atlantic Ocean from Bombay to Europe to America. Notes towards a journal. The Journey. That's where he got the title from for the book. As one is disengaged from the family, the familiar, everything puts on the stranger look of a symbol. The journey itself, the seed's self-exile, the salt estranging sea, the towboat, the guy ropes, the receding wharf with its belittled crowd, its motley of mothers and wives, waiting for the emptiness, the sudden need for telescopes. There's everything here, but everything is anonymous till one sees the faces in the crowd. The faces in the crowd is a quote because it's from Ezra Pound. So this is the moment when he leaves the port and he sees everybody saying goodbye to him, and strangeness will take over, and the familiar is gone, is there, is homeland. And of course, he went back to that all the time.
Self-portrait. I resemble everyone but myself, and sometimes see in shop windows, despite the well-known laws of optics, the portrait of a stranger, date unknown, often signed in a corner by my father.
This is a very powerful poem which uses one of the metaphors he goes back to very often, and that's the metaphor of glass. Because what does glass do? And that's the shop window, okay? And it's about the father could be many things, and I've asked Krishna to read out this poem because it's also, he's relating in this poem Ekaran to his father, which is his grandfather, and it's about also what makes identity. It's about what poetry means, how it transforms us. Glass has two qualities. It reflects, you can use it as a mirror, and also refracts, right? So despite the well-known laws of optics, I see the portrait of a stranger, often signed in a corner by my father. Very interesting way of putting things. And he wrote this just after the boat journey. It's one of the first poems which became part of his first collection, just titled The Striders. And next to it, he'd scribbled Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer, who had this famous short story on the doppelganger, the double. So here the split identity is already there. But it also brings to mind a phrase which has become like the motto and sums up his poetic theory, which goes like this: poetry contains, transforms, and returns our reality to us, and us to reality in oblique ways. You know, you can have it on your iPhone if you want, or because, you know, after all, this is what art does this, and it has a power of transformation and reality to us, and us to reality. This is very important. People think, I study poetics, he's a science writer, a lot of people are involved in arts, and, you know, they don't understand why you're not out there just, to do something useful. I mean, what is useful? Poetry does transform us. So I think this point here, where he has understood that it's also something he can exploit artistically, is very crucial, and we move on to another interesting journey.
I was just going to say, it takes on a new irony when I read that poem.
Yes,
right?
yes.
So.
Another important, highlight irony, modernist irony in Ramanujan. Don't take everything very seriously.
It's a meta irony.
Yes.
When I read it. Okay, this is this entry is the first flight he took. He's now in the U.S. He's now in the U.S. and it's another literal journey. And he had this way of this habit of always wanting to practice his craft, and new experiences were an opportunity to do that, either as prose or sometimes as poetry, as sort of like improvised poetry. And my daughter dances, she does hip hop dance, and the hip hop songwriters have this thing they call freestyling, which is they make up rhymes on the spot to a rhythm. And he's kind of doing something like that here, a kind of freestyling where he's describing this first flight to New York City across America.
Mm-hmm.
And he is writing a kind of prose poem as he goes. And we found these pages in the materials.
So there's a South Indian scholar. He's on his ship, on the flight. This is probably his first ever flight. I read it quickly because we're running out of time and want to come to the end, aren't we, Krishna?
Yeah.
So we can read this piece and then. But this is kind of very ironic, but I read it out. 13th April 1960. I got in. It looked like a good bus inside with the driver locked out in the front. The air hostess opening the door now and then to let us peek at a panel of dials and red pin lights like a radio station. In the back of the front seat were white bags for air sickness with English and French legends. I read only the French, of course. And the plane started quaking, and I hastily, with great and clumsy care, belted myself into the seat next to a rather unclean window, looking out on a noisy monster of an engine. Then it moved like a ramshackle bus. It seemed to me rather aimlessly, all over the place, and wended its way to a cement strip, nose-led by a small, white, nurse-like little plane showing the way, and started running faster and faster and lunged upwards, step by step.
This is a little further on in the journey. Beyond Pittsburgh, jags of blue-white flame with a dull red glow at the source, at the side engines. The city looks a Milky Way of sparks and winks, darkness and cigarette butts pulled at by invisible faces. Sometimes like a skew plotting of light, dots on an IQ graph, with no scatter at all. Sometimes like a pointillist Seurat lit up. Seurat is a reference to George Seurat, who was a painter, French post-impressionist painter in the late 1800s, who devised a style called pointillism, which was little dots of color which add up to a kind of impressionistic scene.
Yeah. So I'll just briefly give you an idea. I mean, his imagistic phase is there, and he's very interested in pointillism. But then throughout the 60s, he writes his imagist poems. But then something happened in the 70s which changed his entire way of looking at reality, and we won't be able to read that passage perhaps, but it's in the book where he experiences, this is the hippie era, end of 60s. People take all sorts of things and drugs and substances, and he experimented at some point, and this is the only instance we found in the book, with mescaline, which is it's made of peyote. And so this whole experience, he records it and writes it, just like Huxley had done, 10 years earlier. And out of that comes a bunch of, ideas and questions and a whole series of Soma poems. He's obsessed with that idea. Also about the tension between continuity and fixity, that tension which is there, because when you take substances or when you go into that kind of mood, you see images flowing, so it's all becoming more fluid. Everything is fluid. And then he thinks, where does poetry come from? And I'm going to read this passage. I think it's very crucial about why he thinks, or where he thinks creative art comes from, and the tricky part of that, and then perhaps the Namalvar poem, and then we finish with a homage to how his life ended. He was obsessed with the idea of where art comes from, and of course the wrong ways that you might tread, or the wrong route you can go if you try to get inspired. And it was not just him, a bunch of others, like even Ravi Shankar said, you don't need drugs, you just play the sitar, that's enough. So this is 30th of October 1976, and he says, the poems, when they come, surprise me. I feel a poem has chosen me, not me the poem. And this is not being mystical. I have the same feeling about thoughts, ideas, events, persons. Maybe there's a certain passivity, a need to say, I didn't work for it. I'm not responsible in my nature. For years, I took the Buddhist slogan, take nothing that's not given literally, except I reversed it to take everything that's given or say no to nothing, which landed me in dreadful dilemmas with food and women. So poetry happens unbidden and has to protect itself. The psychedelic experience taps precisely such experiences, but the junkies seek a separate state and not as an interruption of the ordinary. Perhaps that is what grace is all about. And this is where the ironic distance comes in. My point is, you can't seek such a state, you can't organize it or take a pill for it. In my Soma poems, for instance, the extraordinary occurs in a most ordinary fashion. Something like the way a poem just happens. It's a mystery, but mystery itself is ordinary. Only we make of it something miraculous.
Jazz poem for Soma. Soma? Why Soma? Soma is not Vishnu. Soma, no mimic similar, has no similitude, grows ordinary as mystery, ancient, familiar, the always here. Soma's the same as you and you and you. When you make the right mistake and find your best attitude. So, poets beware.
Poets beware. Your life is in danger. The Lord of Gardens is a thief, a cheat, a master of illusions. He came to me, a wizard with words, sneaked into my body, my breath. With bystanders looking on but seeing nothing, he consumed me, life and limb, and filled me, made me over into himself. So this is the end, but I really don't want to end with the poem that was stuck on a pole when he passed away at Chicago University. A student did something very beautiful. It's a very short poem that I would like Krishna to read.
Okay.
It was on
when my father died, we were on campus, and the flag was flown at half-mast. And on the flagpole, my mother's sister and I found this poem taped to the flagpole. A Hindu to his body. Dear pursuing presence, dear body, you brought me curled in womb and memory, gave me fingers to clutch at grace, at malice, and ruffle someone else's hair, to fold a man's shadow back on his world, to hold in the dark of the eye, through a winter and a fear, the poise, the shape of a breast, a pair's silence in the calyx and the noise of a childish fist. You brought me, do not leave me behind. When you leave all else, my garrulous face, my unkissed alien mind, when you muffle and put away my pulse, to rise in the sap of trees, let me go with you and feel the weight of honey hives in my branching and the burlap weave of weaver birds in my hair. Thank you so much.